What's Underneath is a CastBox original produced in partnership with Studio 71.
CastBox is the fastest growing, highest rated podcast app on both iOS and Android, where you can find all of your favorite podcasts.
You can listen to What's Underneath wherever you get your podcasts, but we hope you'll give CastBox a shot and see for yourself.
Hello and welcome to What's Underneath,
the podcast that will inspire radical self-acceptance through empowering you to embrace what's unrepeatable in you.
I'm Lily Mandelbaum, and sitting next to me is my mom, Elisa Goodkind.
And we are StyleLikeU. In our new podcast, we are going to expand the types of intimate, unfiltered conversations we've been having in our viral video series, the What's Underneath Project.
Each week, we will interview diverse nonconformists about their relationship to style, self-image, and identity.
Being radically honest without shame and holding that honesty with compassion is self-acceptance. So we're here right now with Lorri Davis, who we feel incredibly honored to interview today after interviewing her husband, Damien Echols, last week. He just very quickly is someone that, if you all are not familiar and haven't listened, you should go back and listen to that. But he was on death row for 18 plus years for a crime that he didn't commit. And as we were sitting and interviewing him, we, the whole entire time, were stopping ourselves from speaking to Laurie at the same time because she is the other half of the story. She is also very much a hero as well because she saw the first documentary that was done on Damien, which was during the trial, and packed her bags, essentially quit her job as an architect in New York City, and moved to Arkansas, I believe in the woods, more or less. And long story short, they fought to get him out. It took 10 years. They got married along the way, raised $5 million.
She raised $5 million.
She raised $5 million. So there was no way that we were leaving that interview and not interviewing Laurie as well.
And they sent each other over 3,000 love letters while Damien was in prison.
Which ended up turning into a riveting book that we found. I've read the book and I couldn't put it down. I've read both books, Life After Death, and that one is called?
Yours for Eternity.
Yeah, so thank you, Laurie, for doing this. And we feel really, really, really fortunate that you said yes to us. And we can continue our investigation of beautiful humans.
Through you.
Well, yes. I am beyond honored to be here because I am so appreciative of the work that you do and the service that you are giving to people and their stories. And so completely beyond honored. Thank you for having me.
So how are you feeling right now?
I'm a little nervous.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Have you been interviewed or in the spotlight at all throughout any of this, or?
I have quite a bit, actually, but it wasn't something I was comfortable with. I wanted to stay behind the scenes very much so. And but around 2007, when we had a breakthrough in DNA testing and found a match to another possible suspect, it just became just increasingly important that someone speak for Damien and humanize him. And so the lawyers and people around just kept trying to encourage me to speak out. So I did, but I'm never comfortable with it, even though I think it served its purpose.
Can you just back up a little bit and talk about how this all started?
I used to go to a film series at MoMA called New Directors, New Films. So in 1996, when I was looking through the catalog, I saw the synopsis for Paradise Lost, and there was a photo of mugshots of Damien and Jessie Miss Kelly, and then a slight description of what the movie was about. I mean, I've been obsessed with movies my whole life as a kid growing up in West Virginia. It's a long story, but somehow I got a subscription to the New Yorker, and I would sit on the front steps and just read about the movies and would memorize the movie theaters. And actually, it was the reason I moved to New York, so I could be closer to the movie theaters.
Wow. Yeah. So it was almost like you were being brought closer to him.
Yes, I really believe that. I think my love of movies, and it's almost like I curated, what I would see. I was very particular about it, and I did not want to see Paradise Lost. at all.
Oh, you didn't?
I did not. I had seen a previous film that Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky, who are the directors and producers of Paradise Lost, this series, had made, and I just didn't really care for it. It was a great film, and I think it's an important film.
What was it?
Brother's Keeper. It's tough. It's a tough film.
Is it a documentary?
It is, and it's about a murder. And even though it's just my taste, I didn't walk away from it wanting to see more of their films. And I'm sorry, Joe, if you listen to this, because I think your films are amazing and really are important. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I'm here today because of your films.
They're saving lives.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to see Paradise Lost. And it was a rainy Tuesday, and the film was shown at 9:00. I lived in Brooklyn at the time, at night. Yeah. And we all, anyone who lives in New York, you don't want to sit in a movie till 12:00 on a rainy Tuesday night and then take a cab home in the rain. So, everything was saying, no, don't go see it. All day long, this little voice in my head, go see that movie, go see that movie, go see that movie. And I kept trying to ignore it. And then finally, towards the end of the day, I just realized, for whatever reason, I have to see this movie. It was that strong, this voice in my head.
How do you always listen to the voice in your head so strongly?
If it's that strong, if it's discernible that it is actually really trying to tell me something, I'm getting better at it. I haven't always been that good at listening to it, but for whatever reason this day,
and you were, just to paint a picture, you were at your job as an architect.
Yes.
So you were like, what were you making and
I was
architecting?
I was probably just working on, a big, and most days I didn't do CAD, so I would just be at the drawing table, drawing all day, completely in my head, which I am most of the time anyway.
Mm-hmm. Meaning not present with what you were doing in some other world?
It just, as I draw, then I get so into it, as I think a lot of people who, draw, or you just disappear into it. And that's what I loved about my work. So one of the things. So I went to the film.
So you loved your work?
I did love my work. Oh yeah, I loved it. Went to the film, completely blown away by it. Didn't quite know what to think of it. I grew up in the South, so I understood the culture of the Bible Belt and fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism. I knew where that was coming from. All of the judgment, what he was up against. And so Did you
live around it, or was it actually really home?
It was home. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church with fundamentalists. My parents are fundamentalists. I grew up in that culture.
And you always felt different from it, or?
It always felt angry and judgmental to me, even as a child. But I loved the angels, and I loved the miracles, and I loved the concept of prayer. Mm-hmm. I always did. And I would even try it out, and it always worked, when I was a kid. So I ended up turning my back on all religion. I'm not going to say spirituality, but religion in my 20s. But that was so prevalent in this film. You could just feel it. That's what it was not all about, but that was a big part of it. Mm-hmm. So, and Damien just appeared. He was a kid. It's not like I went into the movie and saw him and fell in love. He was a kid in that film. He was, 18 years old, I think, when they were filming. Then maybe 19. But
so when they released it, it was, how old was he then? And
probably 22.
So it was right at the beginning.
Right at the beginning of his incarceration. Mm-hmm. Incarceration, yes. So I was.
And you were how old at the time?
I was 31. I'm 10 years older than he is. So I was just shook to my core by what I was seeing, and I've never seen a film and felt like that I wanted to take some kind of action, and I didn't know quite what to do. I was very affected by it, and
how did that manifest, in the days to come?
I woke up. I was trying to distill all the different facts that you learn in the film, because it doesn't give you. You do walk out of it with this feeling of a grave injustice has occurred, but you can't quite figure it all out just because there's so many unanswered questions and this. But I remember waking up the next morning with this. My mind had sorted some things out, and I just sat up and I was just like, oh, he's innocent, and what's going to happen to him? He's on death row. And so a week, it took me about a week to figure out, you can just write him a letter and ask if you can help him. And that's what I did.
So your letter literally said, "Hi, I saw the film. What can I do to help?"
Basically, it was a very short letter. I didn't know quite what to write to him. I just told him I understood, kind of. I didn't understand what he was going through, but I understood a little bit about the place where he grew up. And I just asked him, what can I do to help? And I didn't know what to expect, but about a week later, I got a letter back, and he didn't ask for anything. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for books. He didn't ask for anything. He just thanked me for writing and was so gracious. And really, it was a very intelligent, very humble letter. And so I wrote him back, and actually I sent him books the second. Back then, you could still send books personally. So
I know, I firsthand know now how you can send books to someone in prison, because I did it 2 weeks ago, and it was his book. For Father's Day, or whenever great. Father's Day was a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And I now know how you have to do it.
Yeah.
You can't send it personally.
Yeah. But back then, they hadn't started all those rules, so we were sending each other all kinds of stuff.
So he did his first letter back to you like prompt a response, or you just wanted to respond because you were just like taken by the situation?
It prompted a response.
Oh, okay.
Because I think I don't exactly remember what it said. I just remember wanting to write back to him right away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and send a book to him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which later on he told me he didn't like any of my books.
What did you send?
Master and Margarita.
Oh, I haven't read that yet. I need to read that.
It's really, really good.
Okay, so then what happened?
Well, then we just went on this letter writing like explosion, and I mean, it would as soon as I would get a letter, he would get a letter, he would write, and the letter started getting longer and longer and longer. Some were 15 pages long. I mean, these were tomes. And
what did it start to like do to your life?
I was completely obsessed, and couldn't wait. And my work started to suffer. I can remember I designed it was like a pool or something. Most of our work was in the Hamptons and, up in Greenwich and places like that. But I was designing a pool, and I remember and it was being built, and it was completely wrong. And I got called into the office, it was bad. It was bad.
So did you feel at that point that you were like falling for him, or was it like, did it feel romantic yet? Or was it just like, oh, we're having this really deep experience?
It felt like a really deep experience at first. First of all, he was younger than I was. And secondly, he's on death row. So it's not that I was saying, it wasn't that I was saying I can't fall in love with this person because of these things. It just didn't really occur to me. It didn't feel possible to me. But I knew that now looking back, of course it was happening all along.
So what were you guys talking about? Like, was it just
everything? Books and experiences growing up, and just all of these very descriptive. He's a really, really good writer. We felt like we were creating a world just between the two of us, and it felt like that. It ended up feeling like
your
that.
Secret, like, or something like.
Yeah, like it was this. There was this painting by Bosch, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's a woman who's enclosed in a circle. I mean, not a circle, in like a bubble, and her whole world is in there. And I always felt like that was what it was like.
So you had like this life, but then your world was really, that you cared about, was in this bubble that no one else knew about.
And it was
you two.
Yeah.
Did other people know about it? Did you tell your friends, or?
I didn't for a while.
It was like a little secret.
Yeah, I didn't tell my family for 4 years.
Till you had moved, or?
Till I had moved.
So how long?
Wait, let's not get there yet. I'm still in like so was he describing, like, so he still wasn't asking you for anything at that point?
He never asked me for anything.
He never asked you for anything?
Not until we were married, much, much later. And then, of course, if he needed money, then I'd send. But he never asked me for anything. Even when things got really hard, Damien never let me know about how really bad things were. And even to this day, he won't talk about it. I mean, that's just who he is. He doesn't complain, and he didn't want to go on and on about how he felt. So, that cast this very, it must not be as bad as I think it is, which in fact it really was. How
Did
could
you
it
ever
not be?
see it firsthand?
They won't let anyone back
Right.
there. They used to let clergy or pastors. I think they may still do that. Let them go back on the row, but they won't let reporters. They just don't want anyone seeing it. They will take tours through though, and the tours were always led to Damien's cell, like he was an animal in a cage, and they would all just hover around his door, and it was awful.
So, and he
Oh my
was in
God.
solitary confinement this whole time that
He
you
was-
were writing the letters, or was he not yet?
Not yet. He was in solitary confinement for just about 10 years of his 18 plus sentence. So he went in, I can't remember the actual, around 2002 he went into solitary, 2001.
And why did they put him into solitary?
Arkansas had petitioned for a supermax, and supermaxes are extremely expensive. So they had petitioned to the feds for a supermax, got the money, had it built, and then weren't using it. They were just using it for And so the feds came along and mandated that the building had to be used for what it was supposed to be used for, which was housing inmates. And so they decided to move death row into the supermax. And the supermaxes are just horrendous buildings.
Can you describe what
What supermaxes were originally designed for was the worst of the inmates, meaning prison for prison. So say an inmate murdered a guard or something. The supermax is meant for the ultimate punishment, which is no letters, no contact with the outside world, solitary confinement, and they're just horrible buildings and of such suffering, and they're not meant for long-term confinement. It's supposed to be for punishment where you work your way out of it, but they put death row in there, and they've done it around the country in other states where they just lodge all of death row into a supermax because it's
Easy.
and these people are expendable, so let's just lock them
Who
away.
are these people?
Right. I know.
Wow.
I know.
So so how many years were you writing the letters? So
Before things got explicitly romantic and
Yeah.
and you started to realize that this was
and then also what was happening to your life personally?
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't long. It was about 6 months before I realized that I had these really, my feelings were growing for him, and that I wanted to actually see him. I wanted to meet him to understand. And so I went to see him.
to understand your own feelings more.
My own feelings and
everything.
what this was and how it was. And quite honestly, it felt like reason wasn't really a big part of it. I've said this before, but during that time, I felt like it was just automatic pilot. I just kept moving to the next thing.
Yeah, it was like it wasn't a choice. It
Right.
was just happening.
Wow.
Things would come up and I would make a choice. Okay, yes, I'm going to go down and see him. Yes, I'm going to whatever.
And was it being acknowledged that it was that there were feelings on both sides? Like, who said it first?
He said it first.
What'd he
What'd he
say?
say?
He called me. The first time he called me was.
Oh, you were
a few
speaking on
months
the
in.
phone too at that point.
It took a few months before
Before
we
phone
spoke
call.
on the. Yeah.
What was that first phone call like?
Oh my God.
I lived in Brooklyn, and I had a little garden in the back, and I was sitting outside, and I heard, it was still like phones,
Like
like literal phone,
landlines, yeah.
like phones. And I heard the phone ringing, and
Not torture devices that are ruining our lives.
right. I just had this the phone was ringing, and I had this feeling. I ran in and grabbed it, and then the recording. There's this recording that comes on,
Right, from prison.
And as soon as I said hello, I was so taken aback by his accent, this deep Delta, and it was even deeper back then. It's like, "Are you okay?" And I'm okay. That became our thing from then on. It's like, "Are you okay?" Even now, probably a couple times a day with, "Are you okay?" Just checking in. "Are you okay?" I got one on a text on the way here. "Are you okay?" Like, "I'm okay."
Aww.
Yeah. So, and then I think at the end of that call, he told me he loved me, and I was a little, I was like, "This is really fast." I was a little bit not scared by it, but it was. This was getting intense, and I needed to be careful because this person was, having these, and I was too, but I'm a little more cautious than he is.
And you were out in the outside world with with this whole life, with more possibilities, I imagine, than obviously than he had. So you were in different circumstances, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then what happened? What did you say back?
I told him I loved him too, because I really was feeling that for him in so many ways. And I remember hanging up the phone and realizing how I just was stunned. First of all, from talking to him, because I'd never heard his voice, and just the information. It was a 15-minute call. But then I was so...
That's the limit?
Yeah. Yeah. That's how they get you. 15 minutes, and then you want to talk more. So each call has just to accept the call is like a $250, base fee, and then minutes on top of that. It's kind of like a cab. So they'll give you 15 minutes, and then you've got to pay that base fee again, and then it just keeps going.
But can you call over and over again in the same time period?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, so you could just keep
calling.
My
my phone bills ended up being like $5,000 a month.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wait, had you ever been in love before?
Had I? I thought I had, but I hadn't. And being in love really has stages and phases that it goes through, I believe. And so in the initial phase for us, it was just complete and absolute, just obsessed with one another and exploring all of that. And it's hard to believe, but I actually found the letter writing aspect of it so intense, because you're freer to say the things that maybe you wouldn't say
in person
otherwise. And you get to know, especially with men, because he would actually, I would write something and then he would answer me. And whereas now I couldn't get him to talk like that to me.
Yeah.
He's very expressive.
Right.
But
the time that it takes to thoughtfully articulate your response.
Right. And he had the time to do it.
Right.
And he's very articulate, but we just had that time and the space, and I'm just going to call it an opportunity to get to know each other really, really well.
Were you excited, or were you also really in pain and frustrated? Or was it all of it?
All of it. You
Right.
hit the nail on the head. It was such a confusing, emotional, painful experience, just because I had found myself in love with someone I couldn't be with physically. And that's one of probably the most wonderful things, is to love someone and be able to be with them, touch them, and have sex with them, and all of the things you want to do, devour them, whatever, however you feel about them. And that was so painful for both of us, to not be able to act on any of that. But at the same time, sometimes I think those things, when they're in your mind and you are conceiving of them, can be so powerful. And they were. That feeling of not being able to act out on all of the things in your mind, then you just keep ramping it up and up, and then that was a huge component. That was a huge part of it too. Just imagining.
Makes it more romantic and more intense.
Yes.
Yeah. And less kind of humdrum.
Right. And thankfully, we both had really great imaginations. It was really intoxicating, but it was also really painful. It was so many things mixed together.
And so you hung up the phone, you realize you're you're in love. You say you're in love, and so what was kind of happening in your life? Things
were starting to suffer. because I was carrying around this secret, and I didn't want to tell my family. So it's not that I lied about any of it, but I started taking these trips. I did actually lie. I was taking trips to Arkansas, and I would tell I couldn't tell anyone, and I told my...
Did you feel like ashamed of this?
Not ashamed, just that it wasn't shame. It's never been shame. Just a knowing that I wouldn't be understood.
Yeah.
And I just wasn't up for that at the time. But I would have to tell my boss.
You knew that people would go, "You're crazy.
Right.
What are you doing?"
I actually tried it one time with a friend of mine who was a lawyer, the one I had talked about before. And she just said, "You're out of your mind if you get involved with somebody on death row." I'll never forget it, because it did hit hard. She said, "You're just out of your mind to get involved in this situation, because it's
a dead end."
Yeah.
Just pain.
Yeah. But
so you were totally alone, basically, except for him.
Yeah, I told a couple of my friends, and later, like a few months later, and they proved to be really good friends. They stuck it out with me through the whole thing. They supported me, and they never, said maybe you shouldn't be. They just supported me in what I was doing, and eventually everyone did. But it was in the beginning, I was a little reticent to be talking about it.
When did the first meeting happen?
It was in August of 1996, and I flew down to Arkansas. And
how many months since the first letter?
So he wrote to me in February. So
like 6 months.
Yeah, it was somewhere around there. And I was so. That part I was really nervous about. I had no idea what I was doing. You had to get approved as a visitor. I went through all the red tape that you have to go through to go into the prison. But I was scared, and I didn't know where to stay. I remember I was staying at a motel on the outskirts of Little Rock, which is actually a pretty town, but I just didn't know. And I'm just, I couldn't, my stomach was in knots, and I had a very early morning visit with him, at 8:00 visit. And I just remember driving there and thinking how beautiful it was. It's all these fields of just grasses and crops, but it was really pretty. And I'm thinking, this doesn't feel right. It's so beautiful, and I'm going to this horrendous place. And I was just scared. But the minute I saw him, I just loved him. I loved everything. I just was so struck by it. By seeing him in person, the fact that we had glass between us, I couldn't, touch him, and it was so emotional and tough and painful, because that's when you come in real contact with the suffering. Mm-hmm. Because at that point, he weighed about 116 pounds. He was so thin, and he had really long hair. His nails had grown out, but you could see the suffering.
That he wasn't well physically.
Right. That that's when you could see what he'd been through. And it was so hard for me, because then it all came crashing in.
What he was trying to sort of protect you from.
What he was trying, that, and the fact that I love this person, and now
what?
What? Yeah.
And you have to save his life.
Yeah.
Or what are you going to do?
Because at that point, I hadn't even begun looking into the case or anything at that point. But then all of it was too much to even take in. It was, and I only had one visit with him, and I flew back that night.
How many hours was it?
3. And I was foolish because I didn't understand at the time that you should schedule some time after you go into a prison, to have some time just to be quiet and process, not get on a plane right away, because energetically it just destroyed me. And I was in bed for 2 days after that, because it was too much.
What were some of the things he was curious about that he was asking you about?
He was curious about my work. He was curious about what I did growing up, what made me into who I was. What was your answer to that? That's where the letters would come from, because a lot of, as anyone's life is, you think about, my constant need to find isolation. I mean, it was so funny. He was in isolation, but my entire childhood was made up of trying to get anywhere where no one could find me. And even into my adult life, I would do that.
Why was that?
I just love the thought of being in a place where no one knew where I was and no one could contact me. And the cell phone thing is so funny that you brought up, because cell phones just destroy that. I mean, I
know, it's like there's just never a moment like where you're not like, oh, someone needs something. Oh, fuck.
But do you have any idea of why you crave that so much?
I don't. I really don't. I feel like I came into the earth with it, onto the earth with it. I would do things like hide in my grandparents' closets. I would go out and, like, we had a lot of like grassy fields around our house, and I would go into the field and find the highest grass and just lie down in it, because then no one could see, the grasses. Or I'd climb trees, anything I could do to find a place where. And later on, I would drive to motels. I say motels just because that's the place you go to where no one can, and hole up in a motel room for a weekend. Just, I don't know, there was something about it. It felt really good, yeah. Which actually was kind of good for preparing me for the life I was going to lead for the next
10 years.
10 years, yeah.
So it was way more than 10.
The life in Arkansas, right?
Yeah, I moved to Arkansas in 1998.
So that was 2 years after you met him?
Yeah, and then I left in 2011.
Where you left with him?
Yeah.
Wow.
I did.
Wow.
So can you give us like a brief overview of the 2 years before, and like how things continued to transpire until you moved to Arkansas?
Yeah.
Or leading up to you moving to Arkansas?
It just kept getting more and more deep and intense, and the love we had for each other was growing. And I took a trip down to New Orleans because I had a friend who lived down there. And while I was down there, I thought, maybe I can live in New Orleans and still, see Damien. It's like,
were you visiting him over the 2 years?
Yeah.
Like how often?
I would try to go down once a month. That's where the lying came in, because I would have to make up stories. Oh, I have to go here, for my job, because they didn't really like me taking off a lot of time, basically, to go down there.
So over the 2 years, what are you thinking in terms of?
I just realized I can't be here. I can't negotiate this anymore, being here in New York, him in Arkansas in prison, and I realized that I'm going to have to move. My family didn't know anything. They didn't understand why I'm leaving this, what I love, New York, my job.
They thought you were moving to Arkansas, but didn't know why?
They didn't know why.
You just said, I'm moving to Arkansas.
Yeah. I didn't tell them anything. But they had kind of grown used to me being evasive about things. So it was, and they didn't push it. So I moved.
So you didn't move to New Orleans?
I did move to, yeah.
You did?
I did.
Oh, you started in New Orleans?
Yeah, started there. Everything went wrong. And I'm talking to, Damien on the phone, and I'm crying all the time because I was scared. Up and left. I didn't have a job.
It was completely in chaos.
It was completely in chaos. And I don't function well. And all my life before this, I was very ordered. You go to school, you get a job, you do, all these things. I hadn't even considered just quitting everything and up and
so you weren't like
leaving.
Known for like kind of impulsive decision making. You were like on a more straight and narrow kind of path.
It was a combination, because I was known for doing impulsive things, but also at the same time having my act together and knowing what I was doing.
Right.
Like I would make a decision and then I would make it work.
Mm-hmm. So having things fall apart wasn't really.
It wasn't.
You weren't used to
I
that.
would take jumps, and I liked doing that. I liked being spontaneous about things, but I would always make sure
it worked.
It worked.
Yeah.
But if there's any way
this wouldn't work for some reason.
Yeah, this was complete and out of in my comfort zone completely, and it was taking a toll on me. Just the insecurity of it, my money, my money's going to run, fear about money, fear about where am I going to work, how am I going to see, all of it. And then I came up to see him, and I stayed in, I went to see him, and I met a woman at the prison who was visiting another inmate, and she was a journalist, and we started talking, and she invited me to come stay with her over the weekend, and I did, in Arkansas. And that changed everything. And that was the beginning, and I knew I could move to Little Rock at that point because I had 2 friends.
So how long were you in New Orleans?
Maybe at the most 2 months.
Oh.
Not long. Yeah. I had to get out. I just knew it. New Orleans was kicking me out fast. Once I got to Little Rock, everything fell into place.
So you got a job doing architecture stuff there.
I did. Working for the city, which was like a quarter of what I was making in New York. I mean, it was
but
very...
you also have it's cheaper to live in Arkansas, right?
It was very humbling.
Yeah, right. So you never were like, oh, I'm on this path towards just like being in this relationship that will end the way it started. Like,
and I didn't allow anyone around me to say, he's going to die, or what are you going to do? If anyone said that, I would just tell them, you can't say that around me.
Right.
I believe that what you speak and what you think eventually will manifest, and so I'm not going to speak those things.
If you're enjoying what you're hearing, please subscribe and give us a good rating so the powers that be can keep this podcast going.
Did the thought ever cross your mind of like being anxious, like nervous to make yourself that vulnerable to someone who was, you know, in more of a maybe desperate situation like that? What if when he comes out, like things change, or like, you know, like he's no longer stuck in jail, you know, like did that thought ever cross your mind of like being worried about how far you were going?
I wish I would have been more worried about that, because the reality of someone coming out of prison after that long, I wasn't prepared for.
Yeah, I was going to ask. That's on my list.
So I wish I would have had.
Right.
I had Eddie Vedder, who lead singer of Pearl Jam he was like a great supporter, and we became really great friends. Damien and Ed are very close, but you know, it's easier for me to talk on the phone with Ed. He would sometimes come down and visit Damien in prison. But we had a conversation once. He said something about, you know, if someone would have told you that it was going to take, 12, 13 years of, no, at that point we were 5 years in. I remember he said, if someone would have told you it was going to take 5 years to get him out, Laurie, would you have still done it? And I said, yeah, I would have. And we're talking 5 years. Well, it was 7 years later. But I'll never forget that conversation, because we felt like it was the end was close and that he was getting out soon.
What was the experience of living like that?
It was a very isolated experience for me, because I felt separated from the person I was supposed to be with. And so there was this constant yearning for him, and I would do things, read books that I felt would bring me closer. Sometimes we read books together. We watched TV shows together. So everything revolved around a connection.
How often were you able to see
him? We saw each other once a week, and talked to each other every day, several times a day, and still wrote to each other every day. So everything, and all those...
You still wrote to each other even though you talked to each other every day?
Yeah. But it's funny because our conversations...
But, yeah, the mail would come later, right?
The mail would come later. Our conversations were completely different from what our letter writing life was like, and when we were together physically, it was completely different than letter writing or phone calls.
Can you explain the difference?
Yeah, the letter writing was always much deeper. And that's when we would...
It wasn't like the day-to-day.
No, we would process things, right, that we had talked about or when we'd seen each other. So it was more processing, letter writing. Phone calls were the day-to-day, just kind of silliness, like, you know, what's today? And, 15 minutes we had, sometimes more. And then the visits when we were together were more intense, because we were just trying to wring every bit of intimacy and just you couldn't touch each other or anything. But
so you never touched each other, like you weren't...
We could hug each other when I got there, but of course you're trying to do anything you can. So it's this constant watching to see if the guards are watching you, and you try to like kiss each other. It was just this crazy thing.
They wouldn't let you kiss?
They wouldn't let us kiss, no. I mean, but we did. It's just awful, because it's so... Why have those horrible rules? It's... And
so inhuman.
The cruelty.
The cruelty. And then I always thought about, because I would see families come with children and think about keeping those children from their father or their mother, if it was a woman. And it's beyond cruel.
Did it ever cross your mind to doubt his innocence?
Never.
Not once.
Mm-mm. You could feel him. You could feel his spirit. You could feel, and I never doubted it.
And did he ever like feel the need to justify or make sure you felt that way, or he knew that you believed him and he never felt he had to justify himself?
He never felt he had to justify it. No. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
That was one of the things that, you know, from the very beginning, it was just a complete, like, we just trusted each other.
When did the wedding happen in all of this?
So I got down there in August of 1998, and we got married in December of 1999.
And that was also, how did that happen? Who proposed?
He proposed.
What did he do?
How did he propose?
He proposed over the phone, which, you know, there wasn't, like I said, Damien just doesn't mince. When he's ready to do something, he just jumps in. So he's not going to wait to go down on one knee in a visit or anything. He just asked me over the phone, and we had been talking about it. We had spoken about it. I just wasn't ready for it when it came. But when he asked me, I just knew it. I just knew it was time, and it's what I wanted to do. So I got a really great dress, and by that time I had started sitting meditation at the Buddhist Center in Little Rock, and I had a teacher, and so I asked her to do the ceremony. And so what it ended up being was just a big, massive, confusing thing for the prison, which is what we wanted, so they couldn't understand the ceremony. So we kissed a lot. We said, in a Buddhist ceremony, you're supposed to bow and kiss.
In prison, you're allowed to have a wedding.
You're allowed to have a wedding, but they generally only allow you 15 minutes. You get one kiss. God. It's just horrible. But we ended up having like an hour, because it's a Buddhist ceremony. They're longer. We didn't know what we made up all this. Yeah. We made it all up so that
because they didn't know anything about Buddhism.
So that's right. And the last thing they want is a lawsuit because that the Buddhist ceremony couldn't go through as it's.
That's funny.
So the ceremony, we could invite 6 people.
Who'd you invite?
I ended up inviting 3 of my closest friends. One of them couldn't get in, and then Damien asked 3 of his closest friends. We didn't invite any family.
Did your family know about it at this point?
I had told my family about maybe 3 months before we got married.
About the whole thing?
About the whole thing.
And how did that go down?
They came to Little Rock to see me. My parents are very religious people, but they're also very kind. And they've always, whatever I've done or wanted to do, they've just kind of supported me in a strange way that most people wouldn't expect.
Like, you're not necessarily talking about it, but they just do it.
They just say, it's Laurie, whatever. So it was like that, but I could see in their faces, they were very, very scared and worried.
Did Damien and they get along?
When they came to visit Damien in prison, they just loved him. They loved him. How could you not? They loved him. And then they would come visit him every year after that.
So was the wedding like the most intimate you were able to be because they gave you more time? Yeah. And was that like crazy?
It was so crazy. And my face turned blood red, and stayed like that for 4 days.
God. Were you wearing a wedding dress? Were you dressed up?
I got this beautiful, it was red, and it was very like Asian inspired dress, and it had a jacket. It was so beautiful, and that's what I wore. Red dress to my wedding.
And with your red face.
My face was so red.
And was he allowed to wear anything special, or
no.
He had to wear his
prison clothes, yeah.
So he was wearing like an orange...
White. They were white.
You were saying that basically around 5 years in, you thought he was almost going to be out because there was something going on in the case that made you think so. Yeah. Where was that around that time, or...
That was probably...
before it?
No, it was after that. So it was like a year after that.
So what would it be like for you, these moments where you were like, you could taste hope or like a imminent like relief?
Quite honestly, I think it kept us going. It would just feed us hope.
Right.
After a while, it stopped doing that, and we felt, I've often thought about the years around, say, 2008, 2009, it felt like we were in the doldrums. Like literally there was just not any wind. There was nothing. And it was so
Because that was like a decade later.
And it was the bleakest time. And I think it was the hardest, except for when he got out, I think it was the hardest time our relationship suffered, because we both just started to lose even the connection between us. And because we just kept waiting for something to happen, and we're still here, and people are having children, and their lives are, I'm watching people around me whose lives are just keep going, and we're still here. We had DNA evidence come in 2007, and then just
DNA evidence about the other suspect.
Right. And I thought that was it. Oh, he's going to get out now, but he didn't. And it just kept going. The state just didn't respond to it. They didn't. It wasn't enough. And so we just kept working and working on it. That was a tough time, just because I felt like we both needed something so desperately, anything, and we couldn't. We were too tired to help each other, and we were going through the motions, basically. And that's hard to do even when you're together, let alone when you're. So it was a hard time.
He had talked about being in solitary confinement and in prison altogether as a time where he became enlightened. What did you notice about him? Like what, and how did that affect you?
I had, like I said, had grown up in religion, but through Damien, I started to explore spirituality, which is, of course, a completely different thing. And when I started sitting meditation, because he had started sitting meditation, I started to realize this whole other world. But Damien would move through things, and he would devour things like whole subjects or, books. I mean, it's just the way he is, and then he moves on. But then when he finally landed in magic, where his true love, then everything started just taking off, and he started teaching me techniques. And this was after the 2007 or 2008. And that's when we both realized this is the only thing that's going to save us, that is going to get us through this time and through the rest of our lives.
Can you explain it? Just give a little detail of like your side of it, like what that meant, magic, and like what you were doing.
It's the practice of literally bringing in the energy of the divine into your being. And that, to me, it's light. And for me, when I say that, I see gold light. Divine energy to me is gold light. So if you're working with gold light, divine energy, to do anything, how can it be dark or, satanic or whatever?
So you would meditate.
It's a meditation, but it's definitely a process. And you say one of the simplest meditations is bringing divine light from the source down into your body to strengthen that core, your energetic core. Damien has a great way of describing it. When you're born, it's like you're a straw, and you're connected to the energy of the earth, and you're connected to the divine source. But as you start to grow up, and as things start to come at you, and different things on the earth and people and whatever, ego, the straw starts to get clogged up, and eventually we become disconnected from all of it, from all of the energy. So I think magic is a practice that helps you unclog that straw so that you are in direct connection with the earth and divine energy. And then from there, it's just building on that in any, strengthening the energy field around you. And it's powerful. I really do believe that it accelerated his release when we both started practicing.
Let's hear about how that all happened.
Every single day we were doing this practice where we would say, let Damien be freed from prison, let it and be home safe with me, and let it not cause any harm to anyone else or reverse, or I'm not getting it exactly right, but we were saying something like that.
Was there every day on the phone you would do that together?
We would do it not on the phone. We would literally at like 12 o'clock if we could, or we'd pick a time and do it at the same time. And
this is like maybe in 2010 or something?
2010. So what happened?
So the dark phase, this is after the dark phase.
Or the darkest.
I got a note. Fran Walsh, who is Peter Jackson's partner, and I just say that because they're partners in filmmaking. And Fran had been working on the case with me every single day. I mean,
were you working at this point, or were you full-time on the case?
Full-time on the case, on and off. Sometimes I'd go back to work, and then sometimes I was working for someone I had changed jobs and was working with someone who was very supportive and let me make my own schedule, which was great.
So like were you able to raise a lot of the money for the case because of like the film and like everything that like it had some like clout in like amongst like Hollywood and stuff like that?
Yeah, and I didn't have to be quite honest. I mean, I did have to work hard, but people came to us. I mean, I got a cold call from Johnny Depp one day at work. I'm like, what?
Wow.
And Ed, same thing. Ed Vedder contacted us, and then Fran Walsh and Peter Jackson, I got an email from them one morning. They had sent some money to the defense fund, and they said, if there's anything we can do from New Zealand, let us know. Well, I had no idea. I just sent them a note. You could use all the help we can get. I didn't even know what that meant. Well, what it meant was they were going to come on board the legal team. They actually became part of the legal team. Fran is an absolute genius. They both are, but Fran was the one working closely with me every day. She was the one who would research forensic pathologists. She was the one. We both worked together, but that woman is intense.
Wow. So you became like a lawyer.
I did.
Lawyer and an investigator.
Investigator. And I have to say that some of it was kind of exciting. And we were working with a woman investigator. And so it was kind of, there were the women who were on the ground, like Fran was in New Zealand, but still very involved. So the women were on the ground working, and then the men were like in the office. I don't want to take anything away from
How many people were working on getting him out, would you say?
On the team, there were 6 lawyers. We had about 5 forensic pathologists. We had 2 investigators. We had actually hired a PR person because that ended up being a huge part of overturning the case, is changing the public perception of Damien in the case. So over the years, I can't even tell you how many.
Wow.
So it was huge. But what ended up happening, so what started turning the tide is I called on Eddie Vedder and Johnny Depp and Patti Smith and every musician, that Natalie Maines, Henry Rollins, anybody. I said, could y'all come to Arkansas and can we do a concert just to try to get some attention on this? Because we were getting ready to go to the Supreme Court for a very important hearing, which is asking them to overturn the case and let us have a new trial because of all this new evidence that we had. So they all said yes. And this was in August of 2010. And they all came and they had this amazing concert, and it couldn't have gone any better. And everyone in Little Rock was so excited about it. And then we learned that one of the Supreme Court justices, the Supreme Court of Arkansas, one of the justices' wife was at the concert and was very moved by it. She had no problem with talking to us about it, and so we're thinking something is changing. The minds are starting. Mm-hmm. So we had this hearing after that concert. I just get chills thinking about it because one of the staunchest, one of the Supreme Court justices that would have absolutely ruled against us was out, and this new guy was in. There was a substitute. And if you've ever seen West of Memphis, he's the one that questions the rest of the justices, saying, why wouldn't we allow all the evidence in? Why are we not letting this case? He's the one who questions everything. And that hearing, we didn't overturn the case, but we got an evidentiary hearing, which is huge, because at that hearing, we would have brought all the evidence in, and we knew that it would. But what happened was same old tricks. I'm not even saying, it was both sides. Our lawyers, the state started stalling. We can't do this for a year. We can't have this hearing for 2 years. I went berserk. And we let go our lead attorney at that point because,
why was he stalling?
All of our attorneys, somehow it came out that they're all from San Francisco and they all know each other. Amazing, all of them, amazing attorneys. But what I didn't realize was the guys in all the state, like the prosecutor, they don't like these San Francisco attorneys. These are like big wigs, right? So there was never any kind of communication between them. But the other attorneys, they were all working pro bono except for Damien's, and so I don't even know. It got so complicated at the end. Why they were they'd been delaying the whole time, and I had a phone call with them, and I just said that's it. And actually, Fran and Pete were saying, Laurie, and this new lawyer had come on board that was helping. His name was Steve Braga
from
Ropes and Gray in Washington D.C., and he had worked on another case here in New York, a guy named Marty Tancliffe, and had gotten him out. And the reason we got to know Steve is the PR guy we had brought on had worked on this other case in New York with this lawyer. So I talked to Steve. Unbelievable human being. We brought him on as lead attorney in January of 2011. And in August of 2011, I get a call from him. What time does Damien call you? In the morning. It was a Friday night. I had just been to see Damien. I said, he usually calls me around 8. He said, okay, I want to talk to you before you talk to him. So he calls me the next morning. He says, Laurie, we have a potential deal set up with the state, and Damien could walk out of prison on Monday.
Oh, my God.
I can't even, talk about it right now. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
It's been a while since I've thought about this, but I just immediately went into shock. I was like, and he explained it was the Alford plea and that Damien was going to...
It's okay.
That Damien was going to have to accept a guilty plea, but he had fought that he could maintain his innocence in this deal, which sounded so crazy. But I wasn't even hearing it. All I could hear was Damien could walk out on Monday. And I didn't even know, and I knew Damien was going to be calling me in just a few minutes. And
oh, my God.
I know. So Damien calls me, and I kind of almost didn't want to tell him because I know him. And the minute he heard it, that was all that he was going to, and he was going to be able to, who wouldn't? It was all he could think about. And we weren't even sure if it had gone through, if it was going to happen. But I needed to tell him because we needed to get his answer. The prosecutor said, we need all 3 of them to say yes, and then we'll move forward, and we can finish this up in the next 3 days or so.
Oh, my God.
Well, one of the guys said no. Jason Baldwin said no.
No to accepting the guilty plea.
No to accepting the plea. And so over the next week...
Such a confusing...
It was so crazy because we were doing everything we could to get to Jason. I couldn't go visit him. I had no way of... So we finally found this woman that we knew.
Oh, because he wasn't in the same prison?
Mm-mm. And, there wasn't time to write him a letter. So we had to get to him somehow. And I found this woman.
Just to be clear for the audience who's listening, there were three people in the same circumstance that were all associated with this.
But Damien was the only one on death row.
Right. So Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly were the other 2, and they're both in general population. And Jason had a job. I mean, he was actually living a life in prison. He had a job. He had a community. It wasn't as if he had the same situation that Damien had.
And not on death row.
He wasn't on death row. So I'm not saying he was enjoying his life by any means, but prison was a little better for him. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't feel this absolute,
despair.
That he wanted to go through the process. Well, what he didn't understand was that process was going to get, I know for sure they would have milked it for 5 more years, or it was just going to go on forever. And we needed to get to him to explain this to him. And secondly, that the prosecutor had actually said later, you know what, if Damien says yes, then we're doing this and we're done and he can leave. If Jason wants to stay in prison, that's fine. Because they knew the momentum was gone after that. We would be leaving, the whole thing would fall apart. They knew they didn't have to worry about it after that. And I hate that for Jason, but that's just the way it was. So we finally got to Jason. And we finally got him to accept it, and he's still to this day, he still has misgivings. Because what the Alford plea does is it lets the state off the hook so they don't have to pay any compensation. That's what it's there for, so that they don't have any responsibility in this. They can let the person, no prosecutor, no state is going to free 3 child murderers. They're just not going to do it. So that they knew they were innocent.
I have this memory of, and I must have had this wrong, is that what convinced him to change his mind is Damien's life.
That's what he said, that he couldn't bear Damien's suffering because he knew the conditions in which Damien was living.
So what happened?
One of the conditions of the plea is that we couldn't tell anyone that they were getting out. So I couldn't arrange for my cats to go live with somebody. I knew we were leaving. I couldn't tell anyone that we were leaving. I couldn't prepare. So we're moving around in this little bubble of doing things and not being able to tell anyone. And I told some of the people around, and I was allowed to tell Fran and the people who were working on the case with us so that we could at least prepare to have a place. Fran and Pete offered us a place to live. I didn't know where we were going to live. I didn't know what. It was just all free falling. And I remember driving over to Memphis because he was going to be back in the place where he had originally gone to trial, which was closer to Memphis than Little Rock. So we drove over to Memphis. The whole time I'm just in shock, and it was like I didn't even have the wherewithal to get my hair done, or anything. It's like I look back on those times and you're thinking you're going to have press cameras. At least someone got me to a place to buy me some clothes to wear. That's about the most I could pull together. And Damien is just a mess, and I wasn't able to talk to him or see him because he had been moved to a jail near the courthouse.
Was he just ecstatic, or
he was so he was, but the adrenaline, and he had just been pacing his cell. He wasn't sleeping or anything. It was just just pacing his cell. That's all he did
for the week.
And so I remember he had a cold sore on his mouth, and I'd seen that one other time, and that's when he had been moved into isolation. I just knew he was really struggling. Yeah. But we all went to the court, and there's this feeling. Until it's done, there's this feeling that something could fall apart, and that once again,
can't trust it fully,
it's not gonna. Yeah, we'd had so many times, but this was as real as it's gonna get, and it all.
You all went to this courthouse,
and by that time news had gotten out, so a big crowd had shown up, and we're in this little room, and we're just waiting, and the lawyers would text me little things, and one of them actually called and let me talk to Damien for a minute because he was being held back someplace. And then we all went in the courtroom, and it was packed, and the judge said the most amazing. It was a new judge. All the synchronicity of things. We had gotten a new judge in that last year, someone who was actually a kind,
just person. Someone who's doing their job.
A real judge. So it all worked out, and Damien there was this huge press conference, and then all I remember is being in a van and going to the DMV because he had to get...
Wait, were you with him?
Yeah.
No, but how did he walk out? Wait a minute.
Back up.
So he comes out.
So he never went back to prison after that?
He never went back to prison.
The court happens, and then he just leaves.
And he just leaves.
Did he have anything of his possessions? Were there any possessions?
No, he got rid of everything. Oh, actually, no. He carried a small little bag out. It was a daily planner. He had written a bunch of stuff in. He gave it to Ed Vedder. So I think that's the only thing. And in that planner were a couple of photographs that he brought out. And that was it. He didn't bring anything else out. But I remember he came out into the courtroom, and they all had to read their horrible guilty, I'm guilty. They had to actually say it. And everyone in the courtroom was just brokenhearted at hearing this because how hard it was for them. But then they were actually allowed to say, but I didn't commit these, it was this crazy thing. I know.
A ridiculous
system. And then I just remember walking out of the courtroom and getting into a van and
with him,
and then I got scared. I was really scared. Really.
Oh my God.
Probably scarier than I've ever been in my life. From that moment for like the next 5 years.
Wow. Because what do you do now? It's like you're so used to
fight
fight or flight, and like
and you're so dreaming of this moment when you actually get to sleep with this person and be close to them. And he felt a little alien to me suddenly, and I'm sure I felt we got like a little scared of each other,
right? Because you knew each other in a certain way.
Yeah, and suddenly we're confronted with this physicality that we didn't know what to do with.
Wow.
It was really hard, and like I said, I wasn't prepared for it, and I certainly wasn't prepared for
what
the trauma.
He was going to go through.
Yeah, the trauma was. It's hard to even explain to anyone how hard it was, and it's only been in the last year that we've been out of it, or at least started to come out of it. We had someone explain this just recently, and it helped me so much, and I hope this can help other people who are experiencing or are with people who have experienced brain injuries, because that's what I believe people who live in isolation have sustained. So this wonderful neurologist contacted me. She saw us on Charlie Rose, and she wrote and said, "I'd like to talk to you. I'd like to talk to you about, Damien and his trauma." And I wrote back to her. We got together, and she explained to me that what she knows happens is you've got someone who goes into prison at age 18, who had lived in abject poverty before that. So not a lot of experience to begin with. But you put that person on death row, and their brain immediately goes into like high alert, like fight or flight. So you've got this, the brain is in that mode from now on.
For 18 years.
And so there's not a lot of space left. Now, Damien used his brain in the best way possible, but he's not seeing color. He's not tasting different things. He's not seeing different faces. And more importantly, he's not going through the phases we all go through in our development as far as boundaries and relationships. He's not going through those. He's going through a relationship with me, but that's far from
weird
expansive. Way. Right. It's so concentrated, and so you've got your brain that has formed these very distinct grooves that it's dealing with. Safety and just whatever else you're reading. Staying alive. So it's not formed all the connections that we, have. So he gets out of prison, and he comes to New York City, where it's just bombarded. So his brain is being bombarded with information that it doesn't even know what it is. What is this? What is this? What is this? What is this? Noises, people, going out to dinner. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to go to the bank. I don't even know what this is. And then his brain would shut down. And I didn't know what was happening back then, because he would look at me and he'd say, I can't do this anymore. And then he would just sit down. And literally, once again, it's so hard.
It's okay.
I had no idea how much fear and pain he was in. And on top of that, you're putting this person on book tours and movie tours, promotional tours, traveling in planes. And I look back on it, and I should have stopped it. And I didn't.
Right, because it was too much.
It was too much, too fast. No one could. And that's what the neurologist, at least she helped me understand what his brain was what he was going through. And it helped me understand, at least, not that it, in hindsight always, but at least I could understand it. But no one could deal with that kind of pressure coming out of a situation like that. But the problem with Damien is he doesn't show. He walks around like very calm, and except for those moments when he would say, I can't do this anymore, and shut down. So 2 nervous breakdowns in the last...
You or him?
Him.
Mm-hmm. How did that manifest?
He didn't want to go into any kind of treatment, so he would just go to bed and not get up. And he'd be gone. Like, look in his eyes, and there's like no one there.
Whoa. For how long would they last?
3 weeks. And we were in Salem, Massachusetts at the time, so it was really dark and hard. I'd go in and check on him, and I tried to get him to like a doctor to help at least in something. You know,
would he ever like see a therapist, or he didn't want to do it?
We didn't until last year.
Oh.
So he didn't want to until all this time, but we had finally just broken down as a couple, as human beings. We weren't even functioning anymore at the beginning of 2017. It was just, we couldn't.
What were you going through personally? Like you had mentioned when you were here last week with him that your body.
I was exhausted. I didn't know what I was doing most of the time. And it was just this, I was living with a wild animal. Anytime. And what happens with that kind of, it's almost primal, because if anything would trigger, then it's scary. But this is what I'm hoping someday to be able to help people with, because you start to feel very isolated, and the reaction from the person who's been traumatized is sometimes screaming at you, never hurting me or anything, but I knew it wasn't personal. It was just everything in him that was reacting.
Just total overwhelm.
Total overwhelm, and a total...
And it's totally not in his control.
More than a person could handle.
It was almost not
more
even
than
human.
A person could handle.
Right. It almost like disintegrated. The human disintegrated, and it was pure fear.
And he talked about that, feeling like his body was turning to powder.
Yeah.
Dust. Or dust, yeah.
And so as a person who's living with them, the trauma affects you. You become traumatized by the trauma, but you also start to feel very isolated and ashamed. And that's been a hard thing for me to deal with.
Ashamed of what?
Ashamed because you're feeling like, I know I need to be here, but I feel like you can't help associate it with being abused, even though you're not, the person isn't abusing you, but you feel like you're being abused because you're being screamed at, even though you know you're not. It's not personal.
You're in a very bad situation for yourself, but even though it's not really him doing it to you, but it's like, I mean, I guess, is it that it's very hard to draw the line, I think, in your case of what's for you?
And I think that's also the shamefulness. The shame comes in for me, which I just realized recently that I was feeling that way, is that I didn't feel like I could reach out. I felt like if I reached out to help, that everyone would think we'd failed.
And the expectation of, the great love, like, it's all going to be...
You thought the getting out was all
it's all going to be great after he gets out, this fairy tale.
Yeah, and no one knew what was going on. But I think it's so important to let people know that these situations, abuse, horrible, pain inflicted on humans, be it war or, incest or whatever it is that anyone has undergone or lived through, there are going to be repercussions from that, and it's going to affect your family members. It's going to affect everyone around you. But just don't be ashamed about it. Get some help. Find either a therapist if you can't afford it. Look around. There's lots of. But the biggest thing for us,
you're not alone.
You're not alone, and to know that this is a part of the process. It's not anything weird. You're not being. It's not an abusive relationship. Now, they can turn into abusive relationships. I get that. But it's all because whatever the trauma or the pain or the fear isn't being treated. Once we got into therapy, then we had an amazing therapist.
You were in couples therapy together?
Yeah. And it was amazing because we were able to actually have someone finally tell us these things that you cannot be expected.
Help guide you and hold your hands going through this.
You can't expect two people who've been through what you've been through
to not have trauma. And be triggered left and right.
Exactly. But now we're able to see things. So now I can actually speak up and say, this might not, because he's not able to. Even he's getting better with it. But now we're able to see and work together. And I would have to say, it's just like what he said. I've never been happier in my life because we're moving through that. It's always going to be a part of us, but to be able to move through it and start to understand it. And like I said, just being able to tell other people, I'm so fresh out of it. Mm-hmm. It's still, I can still feel the pain of it when I start thinking about it. But I don't think it's being addressed in this way. Mm-hmm. I'm learning that through pain and when you have a lot of trauma or a lot of pain, sometimes there's just not any room for anything else. There's not room for kindness. There's not room. So now when I see someone get on the subway that is just acting horribly, I now look at them in a different way now. I think that person's in pain. Mm-hmm. If they're so angry that it's spilling out on everyone else, or that person there's no room for anything else in them. Or you go into the post office and the clerk is really rude to you, and that's the thing I'm trying to learn right now is these people are in pain. It's not personal against me if someone's rude to me, or if this is something that, and I'm trying to recognize that more. And it's this combination of just be kind as much as I can and not take it. It's hard. It's hard when someone is just downright horrible to you, to be able to stand up against that, or to ignore it, or whatever you need to do in the situation, or help them if you can. But I've got such a different, I was so in my head for so many years with the case and with Damien, and just so completely focused that I didn't think about things like this. And now I'm being given the opportunity, I think I call it, to see things in a different way. And just to know how much pain does drive
people's actions.
All of us, yeah.
And all of your pain has brought you to, at the end of the day, has opened your heart.
It has. It really has. I never thought that it could, because I always felt that, pain was just such a lonely, horrible place to be. But now it's like what you were just saying. We all share it.
Would you trade any of these experiences?
As hard as it all was, and on the other side of it, as amazing and as everything that I've gotten from it, no, I wouldn't. I wouldn't. I feel that I've been blessed with an absolutely amazing life, and I've gotten to learn so much, and I got this amazing man that I get to live with. So,
thank you.
Oh
my
gosh,
thank you so much.
Thank you. Wow.
We hope you were inspired by this episode.
Until next week, that's it from me, Elisa.
And me, Lily.
If you agree that facades separate us and being radically honest brings us together, help spread the movement for radical self-acceptance by sharing this episode and subscribing to our podcast.
You can also watch our videos by subscribing to our YouTube channel and following us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook using the handle @StyleLikeU.
That's the letter U instead of the word you.
And check out our book, True Style is What's Underneath, The Self-Acceptance Revolution, on Amazon or at a local bookstore near you.
We can't skip ahead to a happy ending or live inside a photoshopped image or an Instagram filter. There's no finding oneself when glossing over the truth.